Good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everybody. This has been Lore Lords. We'll see you next time. I'm sorry. Welcome to episode 64 of Lore Lords. Hail Caesar. Atlas, what do you got for us today?
We took a week off last week, and one of the reasons why is because I was super deep in the. I want to spend more time on this one.
Sure.
We're continuing the series that I started of Lore Lords episodes a month. Like when it was, I think it was in the new year. I think it was in January. We did the Alexander the Great episodes.
Yes, that sounds
So
about right.
yeah, we're continuing that. I call the series like Our World at War. Basically, it's what I call it. It's biographies on people who used conquest as a way to reform the world and change it forever. Like people who did so many big things that they'll never be forgotten. Basically.
Right.
So last time we did Alexander the Great, that was a two-parter. This actually won't be a two-parter, even though this has better. Maybe that's why this is better recorded. This is a lot more recorded history for this one. So I can just say things that are pretty factual as opposed to going into details on how Alexander the Great liked to fight as much. You know.
You're right. Okay. Sure.
But yeah, we talked about before, if you want to listen to Alexander Part 1 and 2, we talked about how his conquest led Macedonia from an obscure Baltic kingdom to the most powerful empire in the world in just a couple years, too. Like, he did it in, like, what? He was, like, 24 when he did all that shit, so...
Yeah.
He was... That was a good time, because I think he died before he was 30. That's 100% sure.
Yeah, you can't do as much as he did and live long.
Yeah, well, I mean, he could have. He got like, what? He got drunk and just got sick and died from drinking like stale alcohol. He could have just
That's
not.
so sad.
He could have just not done that. You know, who knows what would have happened if he just didn't. So this time we're doing it again. We're going back deep into the history time. We're back in the BCE era. We are going to the Mediterranean again, but this time it's a different country telling a different story that has been told just as much, if not more, than Alexander, popularized by a certain famous author whose works we all know. And this time we're heading to the country, modern day, known as Italy, in the year 100 BCE, which was 200 years and some change after the death of our previous episode's hero, protagonist, subject, I don't know, Alexander the Great.
I don't know if I'd call him a hero.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I don't know either, but he's, I mean,
A guy who did big things.
he's a hero in a divine mythological sense, I suppose, but that's about it. So we're going back to the 12th of July on 100 BCE, where a man was born to a noble family given the name Gaius Julius Caesar. So I'm assuming, Pat, you know who Julius Caesar is.
Yeah.
You've heard of the
I
guy
mean,
before.
Yeah.
He
kinda hard not
makes
to.
pizza.
Yeah, pizza.
Yeah, little
They're
pizza.
very doughy pizzas.
Very doughy pizzas. The crazy bread's good though, but it's not that good. People say it's better than it is. So anyway, part 1, the early years of Julius Caesar, because I like to go really deep into their past. It's one of my favorite things. 'Cause no one talks about this part, but we need to talk about this part because it's important to understand. Also, this episode very political. Just so you know, this is going to be very politics heavy. And I want to draw a lot of parallels from Roman politics to today, because if you don't know, the American government is based directly off the Roman Republic's government, but not as stupid. Like that, the founding fathers used that as kind of like a base for a non-monarchy government. Because if you didn't know, Rome was a republic. It was not a monarchy originally.
True.
Which is what we're going to now. So Gaius Julius Caesar was born into a patrician family, which if you play games like Rome Total War or Imperador, you probably have seen the word patrician. Basically what that means is these were the families that founded Rome. so they're like even higher rank on like the list of class than nobles are. It doesn't really exist in most other cultures. It's like you had like commoners, which were known as the populists, and then you had military, and then you had nobles, and then you had patricians. So basically, if you were born in a patrician family, which he was, it means you were just set for life. You had a platinum spoon in your mouth. Just congratulations for being born into the elite, basically.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that was Caesar. Caesar was born into this elite family. The family of Gaius, however, was no ordinary patrician house either, but a very important patrician house amongst the patricians even, because his house descended from a hero named Aeneas, who was the legendary prince of Troy, allegedly the son of the goddess Venus.
Allegedly. Well, his name's Anus, so.
Yeah, I guess it is Aeneas, is how you say it. But yeah, Anus. This family was known as the Julii, which is where the word comes from, but it was spelled Gulii, where the leading house of the Albans, as they were called, settled in Rome in the 7th century. So they actually weren't a founding family of Rome, but their heritage was so famous because they're from Troy that they were granted patrician status.
Ah.
So it was basically like, oh, you guys are big deal. Come on in, you're the best of the best with the best of the best. Also, just to explain Roman names a little bit, they have something called a cognomen, which is after your surname. It's a third name. That's what Caesar was. This was very common in ancient Rome, and is actually from the story of one of their ancestors too. For the story Caesar comes from the term. It comes from one of their ancestors being born via cesarean section.
Wow.
So that's where Caesar comes from.
Fucking power to feminism.
Yeah, well, it's a big deal because that meant death generally for both parties at that time. You never survived a cesarean section.
Yeah.
That was not a thing. The mother dies 100% of the time, by the way. That was not back then. There was no surviving one as a mother. But the baby a lot of times would die too. So, but yeah, one of his ancestors apparently survived a cesarean section and earned the name Caesar for the family. So, usually that wasn't done unless it was an emergency, but I guess this person survived it and became a big deal in life. So, there you go.
Yeah, they did a great job actually showing this at the beginning of House of Dragon. That's
a
literal thing. It happened. Well, and it didn't work out.
Yeah. And just for those wondering, women didn't have rights in Rome. So,
no,
so there you go.
Of course not.
People like to glorify Rome as if it was some advanced. It wasn't. It wasn't. They weren't. They weren't like some weird, progressed. They weren't. It was just as bad as everywhere else. So anyway, but what was also Caesarian or Caesar means to cut in Latin, by the way, which is kind of cool for what he becomes, like that title, like cutting.
Also, because he gets stabbed to death, right?
Yeah, well, also, for the emperor means cut, and that's like the emperor title, so it's weird.
Yeah. A lot of irony around that name and him.
But anyway, what was life like in the Julii Caesars? Well, despite all the pedigree mentioned above, they actually weren't important, and they were just old important in that way, but they just kind of were in place. They weren't glorious. They didn't do anything major.
It's like a lot of rich fucking people.
Yeah, exactly. They were just there. They were there because they were rich. And his father, Gaius Julius Caesar, because why would you even bother putting a second on your kid's name, I guess, and just have the same exact 3 names? He was a governor in Asia, so he had some power, but his aunt was the wife of Gaius Marius, who was at the time the most powerful person in Rome. Gaius Marius was consul 7 times. That's like being president for 7 terms. That even back then, when there was no term limit, that was extremely rare to get elected twice, let alone 7 times. So yeah, that's big. His mother was named Aurelia, and despite having a very cool name, we don't really know much about her, except that her father was consul at some point, so she was like a president's daughter. former president's daughter.
That is a cool name, though.
Yeah, or Aurelia is her name. It's just a fantasy name.
It sounds like a League of Legends character.
It does. Yeah, it does. So Caesar's childhood also is pretty much unknown. It's either lost to time or just not interesting. So I tried to look up like what it was like to like grow up as a patrician during this time, and basically similar to Alexander, you were just rich. You lived at home. You never went to school. You had a tutor come to you. His teacher was Marcus Antonius Nepo, who was a very famous Greek orator, or Roman orator, sorry, at the time. So he did have an impressive teacher. Not like having Aristotle teach you or anything, but
that's fucking that's
yeah.
wild.
But still a big teacher. He was a very intelligent person. And so the year in 85 BCE is when we pick up on Julius Caesar's like life, really, for record sure. History, which is actually with the death of his father. So he was 15 years old this time, just turning 16, and he became the head of the household. 15 was the age of adulthood, however, for Rome. So that meant he basically, as he became an adult, he also became the head of his house.
So he was probably pretty prepared for that.
Yeah, he was already like, it kind of was like expected that he could. But his father did die of natural causes away from Rome. Like, he grew up in Rome, so his dad was the governor in Asia somewhere, so probably Turkey. So he just died,
right.
He never even saw most of his life.
Oh, Dad died. Well, I guess I live. This is
guess I'm rich now. So his coming of age, however, would not be an easy one. It would happen the same year there actually was a civil war, where his uncle, who was very renowned, the 7-term president Gaius Marius, and had led a civil war against his rival Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And this normally wouldn't...
A lot of cool names, dude. Sorry.
Oh, all the names are so epic. Like, they're such epic... I feel like that's because we use these names in things nowadays that are epic. But, like, yeah, all the names, they sound so cool.
Do you think in, like, 1,000 years, people are going to be like, Pat Weston, and be like, whoa, that's such a cool name.
Patrick? Dude, that's sick, man.
Even
like our
me,
like our
it
favorite...
sounds like a nerdy kid.
Our favorite fantasy hero, Patrick, Slayer of Gods. Maybe it was pronounced Patrick.
Oh, whoa, yeah. We still argue about that. No, god damn it, it can't happen. My name sounds like the nerdy with the pocket protector.
Or what about Chris? Oh yeah, our hero Triss.
I don't know, man. I think
no, the H is silent, guys. So anyway, civil war happening in Rome wouldn't be normally much of an issue for him, but as fate would have it, Gaius Julius Caesar was nominated as the high priest of Jupiter, and he was married to the daughter of his uncle's ally, Cinna. His wife's name was Cornelia, by the way, which is kind of a cool name as well, kind of where that comes from, I think, which was fine because Gaius had control of Rome, so he was living a fine life. Basically, what this means, by the way, is he was at 15 years old becoming pope. Essentially, he was the head priest of Jupiter, which, if you know, Jupiter equals Zeus, which equals king of the gods. So you're being the head of the most powerful god's church in Rome.
I just gotta say that I love the fact that it's like in 2023 we know so much about human development and the brain and young people and blah blah blah. Things were probably different back then. To be like, yeah, that's a good idea. 15-year-olds,
yeah.
Dude, I'm horrified of 15-year-olds. Oh my god.
Well, I
would put 15-year-old in charge of anything.
There's two things about this.
Yeah.
One is that there's an election for this, so he was voted in. 2, corruption was really bad during Rome in this time. Probably how Gaius Marius was elected 7 times as president.
It's just a theory.
And 3rd, that he was related to Gaius. So the guy who controlled Rome at this time was getting his nephew in as the pope, basically. You know what I mean? Like, so it makes sense as to why he would be put in this role. He's not particularly religious at this time. And he kind of hates everything because his dad's dead and he's rich. He's a rich, spoiled kid.
Yeah, he's 15.
Yeah. So, Gaius' control of Rome, he's getting ready to be pope, but this wouldn't last because suddenly Gaius loses the war to Lucius.
Oh, that didn't take long.
which made Caesar a target to Lucius. And while Caesar had not publicly voiced support for his uncle, due to his familiar relations, he was stripped of his inheritance. So there goes all his money. He lost his dowry from his wife. So there goes all that potential money. And he was banned from being a priest. So there goes his job.
Huh. Wow. What a sudden left turn for
Yeah.
that poor
So
fellow.
at 15 years old, rich white Caesar lost literally everything. And apparently, though, he did love his wife a lot, enough to the point where he actually saved her and ran away with her and refused to divorce her. And they went into hiding.
Wow.
So
is that like a romantic thing? Should I go, wow, that's really
apparently,
romantic?
apparently, yeah. Like there was no reason why he should have stayed married to her because it just caused more problems for him. So he ended up like being like, no, we're gonna go in hiding together and not get divorced.
That's beautiful.
So I guess that's what that means.
I mean, she probably didn't have much of a choice either way. She's probably like, I guess.
He would have been able to stay in Rome if he stayed married to her. So, and because he lost his dowry, she had no money. She had nothing. So he stayed with her. But before long, luckily, much like in our Alexander story, how his mom always came to save him, Mom came to save Caesar because she was actually a favored student of the Vestal Virgins. Do you know who the Vestal Virgins were?
No, but it doesn't sound like she can be because she had a kid.
No, she was a favored student of them. She was not one of them.
Oh.
So Vestal Virgins are, yes, in fact, they are virgins, and they were a group of high priestesses of the goddess Vestal who held high power in Rome, higher than most men. You had to be a woman, and they were the only women who could vote, who could earn income, and who could have any say in politics. And their word was almost law. They were so high respected that when the Vestal Virgins
for not having sex.
Yeah, all for not having sex. They approached Lucius and said, let Caesar come back into Rome. He's just a dumb kid. He didn't even know his uncle. And Lucius actually has a quote saying, I see too much of Marius in him.
Oh.
In reference to Caesar. So that's a weird thing to say because it kind of actually became true. But anyway... He was allowed back in the end, because again, their word basically was law, so Caesar was allowed back into town, and Caesar came back with his wife, and they lived in Rome, and were having a great time, but he didn't have a job because he lost his priesthood.
Yeah.
So what does Caesar do? What do you do when you're down in your luck, and you need a job? You join the military.
I was going to say stop motion animation.
No, unfortunately, not a big market for that back then. He could have become a puppeteer, I guess. That was a big thing. But no, he just joined the military. But this was a drastic change for Caesar because he was the high priest of Jupiter, which is very different from being a soldier. And not only that, but the high priest of Jupiter is not allowed to leave Rome, not allowed to touch a horse, not allowed to sleep outside the city. So he couldn't even leave Rome before. Now he's signing up with the military to get shipped off to who knows where to go fight people somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's just how it is, isn't it? Especially when you're part of an empire.
Yeah. Well, it was just the Republic of Rome at this point. He was down with this, however, because if he was able to leave Rome, he was away from the Sulla faction, the people that won the Civil War. So he felt safer outside of the city. So he ended up going to serve in Asia and Cilicia, which is southern Turkey, basically. And he worked his way up the ranks as a soldier and actually got awarded the Civic Crown, which is awarded for saving lives of fellow Romans.
Wow. Cool.
So he did a good job. He did a good job on the field as an actual soldier. He said, yeah, apparently. So it's something. So there was some military shenanigans going on. I think they were fighting, Persians at the time, and they needed a navy. Rome didn't have the greatest navy, so we need to have a bigger navy. Let's go to King Nicomedes of Bithynia, which was a northern Turkish kingdom, Bithynia, as I say it, and they needed to secure his fleet for Rome. So Julius Caesar was given the job of doing this. He was an officer now in the military, and he went to the court of King Nicomedes to be at his side and win the fleet for Rome. He was supposed to do this in a month. a year and a half pass.
Uh-oh.
And he's in the court of King Nicomedes. They got the fleet after a month, but he never left the court of King Nicomedes and was very favored by King Nicomedes. Many people saw him wearing nothing but a toga go into the room of King Nicomedes at night when his wife wasn't home.
Yo, was he... Ooh.
So he was definitely banging King Nicomedes. Now, both of these men were... So homosexuality in Rome is not... People like to think that it was like accepted. It was not, firstly. It's a very complicated matter to look up. It's a whole episode you could go into about that.
Right.
It was not generally seen as okay for two adult men to have a relationship together. So they had to keep this secret, and they did. But the rumors got out. People saw it. It was talked about. But until his death, he claimed he'd never slept with King Nicomedes. But he definitely did. And they were both married, and adultery was punishable by death. So he definitely did not sleep with King Nicomedes.
Absolutely did not go to Pound Town with King Nicomedes.
But for the record, Caesar did in fact go to Pound Town with King Nicomedes. So that happened. They made
sweet, sweet love for a year. Good for them.
Yeah.
Good for them.
He did ended up leaving the court after a year for, work called him away. And he kind of was, going back to being a soldier, fighting people around the line. But he was an officer. He was a field officer, so he did actually fight, but he kind of commanded from the field, A centurion, I believe is how they would refer to them back then. Now, we're going into part 2, which I call the career Caesar.
Oh, I know more about this, actually, but yeah.
78 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla would pass away, and Caesar would now again feel like he could safely return to Rome. The way the military worked back then was a levy system for Rome. So you were a soldier, but you didn't have to be in the military if you didn't want to. You could go back home until you were needed. Right. So basically that's what he did. He said, I'm going to go back to Rome, get my wife, go back to Rome. So the two of them decided to move to Rome again. But if you remember, he was stripped of his inheritance, meaning he was living off a soldier's wage, which is not a lot of money, especially back then. You're basically making pennies as a soldier. But he was able to obtain a small house in the nation of Suburra, which is kind of, I believe, where the term suburb comes from, which was a small area of Rome that was known as the crime capital of the world at the time.
Oh, no.
So it was, this was like where you would find assassins, hitmen, smugglers, everything. This was the neighborhood for it. So what does Caesar do? He begins working as a legal advocate because when in Rome, I guess. And this did work out excellent for him because he was surrounded by criminals.
Right.
So he, however, hated Rome a lot. He really hated Rome. He didn't like Rome. He's been kicked out of Rome twice. So he becomes a legal advocate to basically try to cut down the corruption of Rome as much as he can. And he became very famous pretty quickly because he had a very good skill with orating due to his high voice. He had a high-pitched voice, which apparently would be able to carry to the back of rooms. And he also made impassionate body movements, which is very Italian. And he also was known to be ruthless, going after specifically politicians and governors, not low-time criminals. And he was very successful at getting them arrested. He would call out corruption where he saw it and get people arrested for this, and he got pretty famous. It's like people would seek him out for legal counsel.
So he was a lawyer.
He was a lawyer. Yeah, he was a lawyer. So the word legal advocate, lawyer, whatever you want to call it, he was a lawyer. Right. He was a lawyer in a bad part of town. So,
which is a lot of money there. A lot of money for that.
So he would do stuff like that. So Caesar, known as a man not to be fucked with at this point, he was an established warrior. He was able to beat back criminals not only with a sword but also with a book in the courtroom, and
beat them with a book.
He was a very good very good speaker. He was able to convince people to put their friends who were politicians behind bars, basically.
Damn.
So someone fucked with him. He was crossing the Aegean Sea for work reasons, and he was kidnapped by pirates.
Yar.
These pirates had no idea who he was, and they demanded a ransom of 20 talents. Caesar, in response, laughed when they were writing their demands, and then they said, "Why are you laughing at us?" He said, "You're lowballing me. I'm worth at least 50 talents of silver."
Oh man, that's hilarious.
The pirates changed their price as suggested, and actually became pretty good friends with Caesar. You know, he would chat. Yeah. They would chat, and they would have jokes and drinks, and he was friendly back to them. And then he told the crew one night when they were drinking to the captain, he said, "If I'm rescued, I'm gonna raise a fleet, find you, and crucify you alive."
Holy shit!
So the captains laughed at him, and sure enough, in the next week, 50 talents of silver show up, and Caesar's let go. He says goodbye to the pirates. He goes to port, shows himself as a Roman officer, raises a fleet, finds the pirates, captures them, and nails them to a cross.
Jesus Christ.
So
he's a psycho.
He did, however, reward them for their good hospitality by slitting their throats before sticking them on the cross in the desert.
Yeah.
So, he was a good dude. What are you talking about?
Yeah. What a nice guy.
So this story became pretty famous. People were like, what the fuck did this guy do? So
that's a crazy maneuver. That's
they're like,
sure.
People kind of in Rome were starting to know who he was. Like, he was this hot shot, like Phoenix Wright, who was putting down corrupt politicians.
Phoenix Wright.
And he was like, people were like, this guy's like objecting at everyone who's being a bullshitter. And then he goes and fucking does that. He gets captured by pirates, survives, and then crucifies them and takes the money back. Like, people were like, this guy's a fucking lunatic, dude.
Yeah.
And he did this. He just told the people in the port that because he's a Roman officer, like, I am higher ranked than you, give me your ship. So they just listened. He didn't have authority to do this because, again, he hates Rome. So he didn't care about repercussions from Rome. He would just go somewhere else. But it worked.
He's like, either I catch the pirates or I don't.
Yeah, it worked, and there was no repercussions for it. He actually instead got summoned to go fight in an auxiliary unit in Turkey, which he did with great success. He ended up fighting off some Persians, ending his tenure as a soldier at that point, going back to Rome. And when he showed up, he had no idea how popular he was. People were like, wow, this guy's like, you're like the guy who killed those pirates, and you went and saved a bunch of people in Turkey. Like, you're crazy. So high-ranking members of the government ended up electing him to military tribune. Which he basically became like a soldier, which basically was a Roman rank to, like, you're able to control the movement of troops if need be. But then he quickly became what was known as a quaestor, which was a high-ranking military title, which is even higher. So he became like a pretty high general at this point. However, very soon after that, in the year 69 BC, he would be saddened with the loss of his wife in the same year. We do not know how she died, but she passed away that year. It's believed to be childbirth, and I believe the child was also lost at this time.
That's brutal.
Because Caesar didn't have kids, and Caesar is famous for not having kids and not having kids with anyone else until much later, which we'll get to when that happens. So he had not only lost his wife, he also lost his aunt, the former wife of Gaius Marius. And he would orate both their funerals. But the big deal was at his aunt's funeral where he was orating. He showed off portraits of Gaius Marius, who, if you remember, was someone who lost a civil war after controlling Rome for 7 presidential seasons. So that was a big deal to show his face. To be like that's like showing a Confederate general face after the Civil War, So it was a big deal. People weren't happy about it, but again, he hated Rome, so he didn't care. So he did this massive funeral. He organized it, showing this stuff, and he was an elected official, so people weren't sure if it was even okay to go there because of the pictures of Gaius that were up. So what Caesar did was he heaved his giant balls on his horse, and he ended up going to Hispania, where he would serve his term as a quaestor there. He would end up working out of Spain, which was half Roman controlled at this point. half was the Torah tribes, but yeah, it was Rome for like most of it. And in Hispania, he had a fated encounter with a statue of Alexander the Great.
Ooh.
He would come up to the statue of Alexander, and he would apparently later mention that he looked upon the statue with great disappointment in himself, because he was the same age as Alexander was in this statue, and he didn't have the world under his feet.
Oh my god, what an ego on that guy.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
So, that was a little bit of maybe ambition inspiration for this guy, who once again hates Rome. But he would serve his post and be elected even further higher in the ranks to Curicule Aedile. Yep, that, in 65 BCE, which is a title served in Rome, so he had to move back to Rome, where he would manage roads and building maintenance.
So a civil engineer.
Yeah, civil engineer, head of civil engineer, but also a festival organization. And during this time, Julius Caesar would become known and loved even more amongst, like, outside of the area he was. He was pretty famous before, but only kind of like in circles he worked in, not like the public, greater public, you know?
Right.
So this would be his access to greater public fame, because he was really good at organizing games and festivals.
I mean, a guy could throw a party.
Yeah.
It's attractive quality.
Yeah, so this was everything from chariot races to blood sports to hunting events. Everything was kind of thrown out there. I want to also just keep in mind the Roman Colosseum was not built for another 100 years, so that wasn't a thing yet. But Circus Maximus was a thing, and that's where most of the games were held. He used this to run for office of Pontifex Maximus in the year 63 BCE, the role of being the head of the Roman state religion. So once again, going for that religious angle, even higher than being high priest of Jupiter from before. Now he's the head of that, of every religion, all religion. So this would be a very big election, because he was going against two high-ranked senators who were much more experienced, and they also were infamously corrupt and getting their votes via bribes. And likely, due to the accusations of bribery from opponents, most votes actually went to Caesar because he had no drama. So it was like you either pick a side or pick the third option, which has no strings attached. So people ended up voting for him. So Caesar ended up becoming the head of the religion for Rome. And in this same election cycle, there was an attempted coup d'etat against the Roman consul Cicero. Cicero was kind of an asshole. He was a corrupt piece of shit. And he was one of the two consuls, and he ended up accusing Caesar of being part of this coup d'etat, but there was no evidence.
Oh.
So he was not pursued in the matter.
Ooh.
Two things about this. He probably was, because he hated Rome. And the other thing is that he was a legal advocate with extreme skill, so he would make sure there was no evidence. So I just want to... He probably did try to kill Cicero at some point and take control of Rome, because he hated Rome. Caesar would then be elected to the role of praetor basically the same year. He became the head of the state religion, and then everyone else is like, you know what you'd be better at? Controlling the governor and military duties, which gives you your own army.
Wow. Well, he probably loved that.
So he just threw that onto his list of titles at that time, where he became praetor, got his own personal army. This is great, but he did have to run a political campaign for this, which means he spent every dollar he had. Sorry, every talent he had, every septum he had was spent in this campaign, and he ended up taking a lot of debt during this time. And he wasn't wealthy. Remember, he lost everything. He had like no money. Everything he was doing was just like his living wage. And he was never really able to afford any of these political campaigns, because, as you know, they're pretty fucking expensive. Yeah. So it's no different back then. And he was so good at being praetor that he would actually be made propraetor, which is just like another version of praetor, which is like, it's like you can be one of the other kind of things. He just became that, and he was able to return to Iberia, where he would rule over Hispania Ulterior, which is a crazy name,
Oh my god.
as like the governor of that area, basically. So he had his own. He would have a small army in Hispania. He would govern Hispania. He would make sure no barbarians took over Hispania. Like, that was kind of his job.
Rome is like a fucking fantasy land sometimes. Just like the names, what they fought, what they dealt with. It's like throw a couple of mythical creatures in there and you just basically have a fantasy story.
Yeah, well, I think that's because it's the inspiration for it. But the fact that you could get like 7 different political offices in the same year is insane. Like, who's regulating this? But again, no one was. It was a pretty broken system, and Caesar hated it. So
reminder, he hated it.
He hates Rome. So he was poor, in debt, and he was in debt and had a lot of creditors coming after him and debtors coming after him. So he couldn't actually leave the city legally until he paid his debts to go to rule in Spain, where he was supposed to be ruling from. So he actually ended up turning to one Marcus Licinius Crassus, which, if that name sounds a little familiar to you, it is because it is the same Crassus from the story of Spartacus. Crassus was known at this time as the richest man in Rome, and he actually was kind of a fan of Caesar. He liked Caesar's way of things, and he agreed to front Caesar's bill in exchange for nothing but political favor against the interest of another Roman influencer named Pompey.
That's a rough name to have.
Yeah. It was. It's again, these names might start sounding familiar because they're in other famous stories, like the Spartacus story. Crassus is a big player. This is the same guy in the Republic of Rome. So, he's rich. So Caesar would leave for Hispania now that his debt was paid. And with his forces, he would end up conquering 2 tribes of Tauran barbarians in the area who had been threatening the region for many years, which kind of gave him a lot of favor in the military as well. Like, this guy just kind of showed up and just beat them. We don't know how he beat them, but we do know from other things that he was a very good military tactician, similar to Alexander the Great.
Right.
And he was so impressive at military tactics, he was given the title of Imperator. Which, despite sounding rad, is actually just an honorary title. It actually doesn't give you anything. But what it does mean is that you're a big deal in the battlefield. And it's a prerequisite to having a triumph.
And you unlock a really cool spear that you can use in combat.
You unlock the next tier of gear you can equip. So a triumph of Rome, if you don't know, it's like a big celebration for a general. You've probably seen it in like films or shows. It's like when the general's like parading around with his laurels on his head and he's in the toga and the chariot like waving. People are like throwing flowers down. That's a triumph. And it's a big deal because it means everyone gets to know your name.
It makes sense. You're out getting paraded as a hero, I guess.
And if you are like made a hero like that through triumph, you are almost guaranteed to get what you want in the next political election.
Oh boy!
Because it's like
that's exactly what he's looking for.
Of course, we want to vote for this guy. Like, he's a hero, Like, it's just that's how it worked. So he was able to get a triumph. However, this was a big deal for Caesar, but it wasn't all Caesar wanted, because he also wanted to run for consul, which is another, which we talked about before. It's the presidency, but the way
leadership position,
it's the leadership. It's the president basically. But the way consul works is there's 2 of them in Rome. 2 consuls get elected. You have 2 people from 2 different political parties run the country.
Right.
There was 3 major political parties at the time. There was the patricians, the populists, and the militarists. Those are the 3 major ones who ran it. Patricians wanted nobles to be powerful. Populists wanted people to be powerful. Spoiler: they never won elections. And military, of course, wanted military power. It was always military and patricians lead consulships.
So basically the Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, Caesar didn't have a party, and he wanted to run for consul. He was a populist, though, for the record, because he lived with poor people for a long time and was a poor person for a long time. He was a made man at this point. He was born not a made man, and then became a made man. Unfortunately, if you have a triumph, you have to be a soldier, obviously. You have to be a military member. And to be a consul, you have to be a private citizen.
Oh. Wow, he can't have both. So
Yeah.
what did he do?
If he wanted to run for office in the next election, he would have to step down from the military and miss his triumph. So what he did is he wrote to Rome, to the consul, saying, "Hey, I want to run for office of consul in absentia, so I can have this triumph going on." The consul at the time, Cato, blocked the request, which I'm sure really made Caesar like Rome more, and also gave him and made him have to make a choice. So he decided to step out of the military and run for consulship.
Oh, all right. So he don't get the triumph
No,
then.
no triumph for Caesar. And now we're going to go into part 3, called the First Triumvirate, which, if you might remember that term from history class in school, it was a big deal. And we're going to talk about how this started and what the First Triumvirate even was.
Okie dokie.
In 60 BCE, Caesar ran for election of consul, the highest political office in Rome. It was an infamously rough election with very close candidates. So Cato, one of the current consuls, and Cicero, the other two, both hated Caesar for thinking he tried to overthrow the government a few years back. He probably did. Cato was known for being the most clean and uncorrupt consul there had ever been in Rome. Didn't do bribes, didn't deal with crime, and he started bribing people to not vote for Caesar.
Well, that's pretty common still today.
Yeah. So, but my point is he was like famous. He never would vote for, or never would support bribery or do any corruption stuff. He was super anti-corruption. Ended up getting corrupt because he hated Caesar so much that he didn't want Caesar to lose the election, or wanted Caesar to lose the election. So he tried to do everything he could. So in the year 59 happens. Caesar wins the vote. Just because people liked Caesar more. People liked Caesar. They liked that he wasn't in a party. And then when he wins the vote, he joins the populist party. So just because, he hates Rome. And he ends up winning the vote alongside Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, who was a conservative party member.
Sorry, it was...
Bibulus.
Not every name is cool.
Marcus Calpurnicus Bibulus. Bibulus. So yeah, he was a conservative, so the complete opposite of Caesar, and they would both become consul. Caesar was now president. He was 40 years old. He was president of Rome, basically, consul, but he had to share it, but he would start beginning his plans right away. Now, if you remember, he was in debt to Cassius.
That's right.
So he had a lot of money to his, he had a political favor debt to pay off, where he mentioned that he would go against the interest of Cassius's political rival named Pompey. But Caesar was very smart and decided to not listen to Cassius, who he owed a political favor to, because guess what? That's not in writing anywhere. That's just a favor you owe someone, so I legally don't have to pay you back. But he kind of liked Pompey's ideas. So, funnily enough, he didn't agree with the richest person in Rome, almost like he hates Rome. So what Caesar did was he actually got Pompey and Crassus together in a room and locked the door.
Oh.
And he decided fueling political rivalries gets you nowhere. So he put them in a room alone with wine and said, "Become friends," and locked the door. And guess what?
You have no choice but to drink.
Yeah. And guess what happened?
They killed each other.
It worked. They became friends. They got drunk. They realized they weren't that different from each other. They became good buddies somehow, probably alcohol. And the three realized together, with the consulship, the richest man in Rome, and a very powerful military commander being Pompey, they control public business together. So they did. Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey, cementing the alliance between them. We don't know where Julia comes from, by the way, because he's famous for not having sons and daughters, but he had one. So we're not sure if Julia is adopted. We're not sure if Julia is from his wife and just stricken from the books for being a woman. We don't know where Julia comes from. It's possible she was adopted. I think he just had a daughter. Personally, it just makes sense to me. It's a little bit. It's a little bit debated.
People.
What was that?
He probably boned more people.
She was an adult. Age makes sense. He had it with his daughter, with his wife.
Right. Okay. Well,
so it's just like I think that just happened, and it's just kind of like forgotten. But anyway, marrying Pompey to Julia, his daughter, cemented the alliance between them, and they became known as the first triumvirate, rule of three, oligarchy, basically taking over Rome right now. The first thing he did was give public lands to the poor. So, rich people didn't like that. The rich people didn't like that poor people were getting things. And so Caesar knew this would happen. So what he did is, if people refused to do this, soldiers would go after them. The supporters of this bill were Crassus and Pompey, obviously.
This is what conservatives think is going to happen, by the way, in America, if socialism takes hold.
Yeah, it did happen in history once, but not quite the way they think it's going to happen. So Crassus and Pompey agreed. They supported the bill, obviously, and everyone went, "Oh fuck! The three most powerful people are in league with each other," and realized this was very bad for their way of things. And there was a huge public forum held by Bibulus, his other consul, against the triumvirate, against the notion, saying everyone needs to rise up against this. Bad omens are coming. Caesar supporters showed up at this public forum with swords and started stabbing people and chasing people away. Bibulus himself was chased out with his own closest magistrates, who, when arriving at his home, the magistrates were wounded, and his bodyguards had their weapons broken and were wounded, and he himself was covered in a bucket of shit.
Yeah, that ain't cool, man.
So that's what you get for speaking out against the triumvirate. Bibulus would not be seen again for a year, doing all his work from home because he was afraid for his own life.
No, Bibli.
And what Bibli would try to do constantly, which is shit talk Caesar and Pompey and Crassus, and like send out letters to trying to get other people to vote against him. But he was so bad at trying to stop Caesar that political satirists, which think like political cartoonists at the time, referred to the year in their newspapers as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Because Bibulus was such a little bitch, he couldn't even go to his own seat because he was afraid to leave his house.
God damn.
So the consulship was pretty well liked by people. The people liked Caesar; they loved him, and his fellow politicians despised him deeply. But Caesar didn't care because Caesar hated Rome. And he was doing wild things in office that people hadn't done before, like help people. So they were always trying to stop him, and he knew he could be persecuted after his term ended. So what he did was he passed a bill giving himself governorship of northern Italy, at that time known as the Cisalpine Gaul, and his consulship would then end, and he would become governor immediately. So he couldn't be persecuted. He would already be put in a position where he couldn't be. So his
I wrote the law.
Basically, yeah, his consulship came to an end the same night he left Rome. So it was like election night. Instead of doing a speech in front of a crowd, he just booked it.
So he lost the election, though?
No, he didn't run again. He did not run again.
Oh.
He became governor after went to Rome, or went to go in Cisalpine Gaul. He would take his new post, governing Rome, be in heavy debt, as always, and had to make money. And he decided, you know what's really good at making money? War.
Oh, no.
So to the north, the Gauls, the famous opponents of Rome, Caesar specifically, were living there, a.k.a. French barbarians. And the Gauls were having problems organizing, and they were infamously unstable, as their chiefs couldn't agree who was in charge. There was also Germanic tribes, as you know, Germany is north of Italy, and they started to arm themselves when Caesar showed up with 4 legions of troops because they thought it was a threat. And Caesar saw this as aggressive posturing to legally attack them.
Oh, well.
So?
Well, I mean, look, I played Total War Rome 2 quite a bit.
Yeah.
In my time. And I could say, these guys are pests. You know what I'm saying? They constantly bother. Those French, those Germans.
Yeah.
They're
they're always trying to raid us, so let's go kill them all. So he did. Caesar moves his troops into Gallic land and killed the Germanic tribes that were there, and then ended up meeting up with an army force of the Gauls, and all the Gauls unified for the first time to fight these 4 legions of Caesar, and they drastically outnumbered him, which made up for their lack of organization, because the battle actually ended in a stalemate.
Oh.
Both sides had to retreat the field due to heavy losses, and so what did Caesar do? He just decided to go after the tribes one by one, burn their homes down, and it worked.
Jesus Christ. Well, yeah.
So each tribe would be attacked, so they would break off the alliance because they had no, they had never agreed on anything, and he would just use his army, which stood up against all of them at once, to take them out one at a time.
I bet that was easy.
So yeah, it was pretty easy for him, smooth sailing. And with war comes money. You get not only income from raiding their towns and getting their stuff, you get slaves. You get a bunch of weapons. You get a bunch of clothing from their people. You get their people. You get their towns. They can make money for you now. You can tax them. So he was making a lot of money doing this.
Right.
So he liked it, and one of his legions was ordered to move north, taking most of modern-day France for Rome and ending on the shores with their eyes on Britain. Rome had not been here at this point. It was a very mysterious land. They had heard a lot of stories of riches and wild magics of the Druids in Britain, so he was keen on finding out about that. Things were looking great in the conquest side of things, but they were not looking great back at Rome. Caesar's political alliance was becoming undone because he wasn't the consul anymore, so he had to return to a meeting of the triumvirate, who ended up giving Caesar another 5 years of governorship, basically like making him immune to persecution for 5 more years again, while they kind of dealt with things. They kind of renewed their rebuilt some trust with each other, and they kind of went back to running Rome while Caesar was off running the wars. So he would have 5 more years to do what he could with fighting the Gauls, and he would use his time wisely, destroying more barbarian tribes by the day and fully taking control over modern-day France. His eyes were set upon Britain, though. He really wanted to go there, so what did he do? He built some boats and forded the British Channel.
It doesn't take long.
No, not that bad, not that big of a task. And he arrived on the Isle of Britain in the summer of 55 BCE. His knowledge of the land was incomplete, and when he landed, he had no map. He had no guide. He just had Romans that landed on Britain, and sure enough, he was immediately attacked when they got off their boats by the Britons, which were, the tribe of Druidic people that lived there. They were extremely unorganized and got destroyed by the Romans. Caesar chased them into the inland a little bit, burning their villages to the ground, raiding a few villages, getting some money where he could, but winter was setting in, so he had to go back to the Gaul lands in France, and kind of back to his base. But before he left, he made sure to plant some eagle standards with the big old SPQR on them in the shores of Britain to make sure they knew he was coming back.
Yeah.
Which, spoilers, the snow ended and he went back to Britain.
What did he do this time?
This time he had an army that knew where to land safely and where their bases were. So he just destroyed them without competition. But fortunately for the Britons, during this attack, Julius Caesar receives word that Gaul is in revolt due to poor harvest. So the Gauls are rising up against the Romans, and so he says, all right, we'll leave Britain for later. And he leaves Britain, never to return again. However, he does start the legacy of it being considered Holy Roman land, which would last forever. This all starts from Caesar planting his banners in the beaches of Rome, or beaches of Britain.
Wow. It doesn't even seem like he was there for all that
No,
long. And that
he was not. He was there for a couple months. And yeah, Jesus. He kind of started that whole thing, which still goes on today.
Wow, Britain's got cucked. They are such cucks. God damn.
They just got destroyed.
Holy shit. Continuously, too, throughout history. Let's keep going.
Let's get them. Take them out. So, at this point, the Gauls were an even match for the Romans here, because he didn't have support from Rome. They were busy doing fighting mostly in the Middle East, so they didn't have like legions to spare. He just had 4 legions.
Right.
The Gauls had Roman weapons that they were able to pick up. They had large numbers, but they did still lack training and discipline, and their biggest issue, again, was their chieftains just could not agree on who was leader. So, they were always bickering and fighting, wanting to be each other's boss. But soon, as they would come to these meetings, known as the Gallic tribal holdings, they started noticing less leaders were showing up, because Caesar was killing them. So,
well, okay.
So basically, a Gallic commander by the name of I'm going to have to say this so many times too. Vercingetorix he would unite the Gauls as a hero because he was a known warrior in a valiant attempt against Rome. He actually would meet Caesar himself in battle in the defense of one of his towns at the Battle of Gergovia, which we're going to talk a little bit about this battle right now. Caesar would approach this battle with a tired army that had marched from the coast of Brittany all the way inland to meet this town. They were tired, they were exhausted, and he would have his troops rest during the day at outside the town in preparation to raid it at night. In this raid, he would secure a hill that was essential to the Gauls' defense and station 2 legions there and dig a trench for his troops to move from the hill to their supply line. This trench was dubbed as also doubled as a wall from the Gauls' ability to reach their own supplies. So basically, he just cut their supplies off, and instead of just having people stand there, he dug a trench and put a wall up on it, so they couldn't even get through it. And also, he was able to safely move the troops back and forth. And this is a good example of the difference between Alexander and Caesar. Alexander was about speed and attack. Caesar was a turtler. He turtled hard. That was his strategy. And he was the first person in history to really be like, you're not going to break through me.
All right.
So this was He had engineering. Engineering was his big thing. He had a big regiment of engineers in his forces. So they dug this. This trench was so well built, it's still there today.
Wow.
You can go visit it. And there's signs about the battle going on there.
You know, this is the time, too, where, like, a lot of engineering became more, important and valid and stuff like that.
And we're going to talk about...
has a lot of that.
We're going to talk about that soon, because the Gauls didn't know what the word engineering was.
Right.
So,
sure.
The Gauls ended up having a trick, however, up their sleeve. They had convinced the Roman Gallic allies to join up against them. And sure enough, Caesar and his troops left the supply line with the Roman supply corps to be guarded by the Gallic allies who said they were loyal to Rome, and they turned on them and took the supply line back for the Gauls.
Ruh-roh.
Caesar was taken by surprise, and he had to now break his siege of the Gaul city to return and take out the betrayers and secure the supply lines again. And he did so, with the help of traitors within traitors, who sided with Caesar. So there was a tribe of Gauls that were part of the Roman army. Right. Vercingetorix convinced them to join the Gaul side again, so they did. But then half of the Gaul traitors thought that was a bad idea because they saw Rome was much stronger. So they sided with the Romans and betrayed the traitors. Are you following me?
Sounds like, yeah. It just sounds like it just sounds like people who, you could just go up to those people and be like, hey, did you know that color in the sky? It's actually not called blue, it's called red. And they'd go, oh, okay. And then they'd go up to somebody and go, that's actually red. And they go, no, it's fucking not. It's blue. And they go, oh, okay.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Like, it just sounds like people who literally just fucking, oh my god, what jackasses.
But it did luckily help Caesar out for Caesar in this time, because they ended up fighting back. They fought back they were called the Aedui is what they were called. They ended up fighting for Caesar, taking back the supply line, and Caesar received word that he had the 2 legions he left to defend against the Vercingetorix's troops were failing. They were not holding the line well. They were drastically outnumbered and outsupplied up there. And he knew he was in a bad position, and he knew he was surrounded. So Caesar left 1 legion behind as a decoy and led the rest of his troops around the area, capturing 3 Gallic camps and ordered a retreat to lure Vercingetorix's men off the high ground, where he would then be able to flank them. Unfortunately, the order was not heard by all legions, and one of the legions continued to press the attack to the point of exhaustion.
Damn, that sucks.
The Roman...
I bet people are just like, why isn't anybody telling us what to do right now? We've been at this for hours.
This communication was a big issue back then. They had to send letters or by this time word foot messengers, and if the messenger gets shot by an arrow, at this point there was no. They would use flags at this point, but it wasn't possible in this terrain. It was around a hill, so they couldn't see the flags inside the hill. So they had to send messengers, which probably is what happened. They just got killed on the way.
Yeah, we need some flare guns now.
Yeah,
the flare guns.
But luckily for Rome, they had the Aedui, their Gallic tribal allies, who showed up to help the Romans on their siege. But the Roman soldiers there, who didn't know word of this, saw Gauls attacking from behind and slaughtered the Gallic allies.
Yikes, that's not good.
No, not good. So they showed up like, well, your allies support. And he's just like, oh, fuck, barbarians. They killed them all.
Oh, my God.
So Caesar was like, fuck, this is bad. Sounded the retreat horn. And all his guys organized again for a retreat, but they were crushed by a Gallic cavalry charge led by Vercingetorix into the Romans' retreating line, resulting in major losses for Rome, and the battle was officially won by the Gauls.
He doesn't sound like he was as good as Alexander was.
Alexander never lost, Pat. Caesar lost this battle. He'd never lost to this point, but he did lose. I just want to point that out there. The battle, which I also want to show this battle off because I want to show battles where these famous conquerors get beaten. I think it's important to show that.
Oh, yeah.
Caesar states in his records that 46 centurions died along with 700 legionnaires. Modern historians say that's obviously bullshit, and it's likely to 20 to 40,000 dead legionnaires.
All right, Putin.
So yeah, 100%. Well, of course, you can't make the people in Rome think you're that bad. The 40,000 people died, but the numbers don't add up to the amount of the legions and how much. So it's likely that 20 to 40,000 died, including allied auxiliary troops, being the Gaul barbarians that were Roman. Which he likely just didn't even include in his in his case, in his numbers. He's just like, they weren't people, they're barbarians. I don't care. So,
oh my God.
With Gaul proving a real threat now, many were signing up under Vercingetorix, but unfortunately, it would prove to be too little too late because Caesar didn't take defeat lightly. And we're going to go on to part 4, the Siege of Alesia.
Oh.
In the defeat of Gergovia, Caesar was met with Gallic cavalry, like we mentioned, but eventually he did turn face and find this force of Gallic cavalry, and when actually met head-on, their lack of training was shown evident as they basically were forced to retreat with no loss to the Roman soldiers.
Oh, wow. That's embarrassing.
Basically, when they just turned, yelled shields, and threw spears out, they panicked and died. So, they just didn't... The Gallic cavalry wasn't good trained, and they didn't want to die. So they basically ran away, and a lot of them just never went back to the army. They just went back to their villages. So they lost a whole cavalry regiment was lost. Caesar saw how good the Gauls fared in field combat in the last battle, so this time when he knew he was going to opt for a siege, and he went to the city of Alesia. This was a city on top of a hill with rivers around it. Think like how Paris is, it's like an island basically, but an island, but the rivers were small, so it wasn't like huge rivers. So he goes to siege this city, and unknown to him, Vercingetorix actually planned for Rome to seize him because he already had a backup army outside the city waiting to do a pincer attack. However, looking back, it is very clear that Vercingetorix had no idea what a Roman siege was. As he had previously only battled barbarians, so he had no idea what he was in for. Over the span of a month, 25 miles of walls and trenches were built by Rome. They had anti-cavalry moats, towers, booby trap pits in the field all around the town, completely encircling it. 2 sets of these were built as well. One protected the defenders, and the other protected the relief forces in the back, so they could swap out, soldiers. They wouldn't man the walls for too long.
Yeah, gotta keep them fresh.
Yeah. So the Gallic army arrived soon to attack the back of him, failed completely. Couldn't get through the walls. The siege works were way too good. The city of Alesia was on top of a hill with rivers on both sides, like I mentioned. So when the Gauls sent out cavalry to attack their construction efforts, it was visible by the Romans. So they were ready for it every single time.
Right.
Word, however, was able to leave the Gallic troops as he sent word out to the other Gauls in the area saying, you need to come fight, I'm trapped here, come kill these Romans. And Caesar ended up digging another advanced trench when he found out this happened. So he built a third trench a mile away from the other trenches, making the siege work even bigger to have in case a surprise attack comes, he would have a wall. And he would dig up 2 more trenches between these trenches to have moats and basically booby trap pits between them.
God damn.
So
he was prepared for all angles.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, him being a turtler. He was really into building siege stuff. And troops were being moved around so much, as you might imagine, because he needed wood. So he would deforest large amounts of France in this time to build all these. But when the troops go out to cut down trees, the Gallic cavalry would attack. So what do? You build even more defensive structures at your lumber camps. So now these lumber camps also had walls and towers with archers in them and ballista in them. And this is why, in a lot of games like Civilization, for example, Roman legionnaire units can cut down trees and build roads, because Roman legionnaires were proficient workers. A lot of them were trained in mining and forestry.
I've never played as Romans in Civ.
So they're very good at this. They're you need to cut down a forest, it's fucking done. We literally have carpenters and fucking botanists and foresters in the troops, trained. So they just fucking did it. There was no issue to them.
That's awesome. I mean, it's... Oh, no, yes, I have. But yeah, no, okay.
Yes, I have. So,
yes, I have.
Alesia held 80,000 Gallic troops in them, and food is running low. So what do? You send out the young, sick, the wives, and the children outside of the walls. I say wives because there were women Gallic soldiers. So, but when you were a lot of the older, non-women soldiers were sent out with the kids, right? He hoped Caesar would allow them through his defenses since they're women and children and elderly, and Caesar said, no, fuck you. So Vercingetorix refused to let them back in. So they ended up starving to death in the field between the siege works and the city over the next couple days.
Oh my god. The people
So
who want nothing a part of this. They don't want any part of this at all.
Super fucked up on both sides.
Yeah.
So during this happened. That was pretty fucked up. During this time, the Gallic relief forces that he sent word out to showed up. And they had a massive army forming on a hill behind the Roman army, which Rome obviously saw. But, it was a bit of a scare. And they did charge the defense. And at the same time, the troops from Alesia, those 80,000 troops, broke out from the city and started attacking the siege works on the other side. They were able, it was a massive pincer, but they made almost no progress, and the attack failed heavily for the Gauls because they just couldn't get through the walls.
Damn.
The next night, the Gauls attacked again, but they were stopped by 2 generals, who's now we're going to start getting some familiar names. You're going to start recognizing some names. 2 of the generals of Caesar would stop them. Mark Antony and Caius Trebonius,
Oh yeah, okay.
for known as Caius a lot, who were able to rally the support troops of the attack and force the Gauls to retreat back before they got encircled. The next attack, 60,000 men attacked what was seen to be the weak spot in the Roman defense, which it was in fact a weak spot. It was the only area they couldn't build on because there was a natural bump in the terrain. So 6 cohorts of cavalry would be set by Rome to defend this attack, led by a man named Brutus, who would attack and repel this attack. So they stopped this. And this would be the last attack of this before the Gauls realized that they couldn't get through these walls. It was impossible, and they ended up abandoning the defense. And the idea of revolting against Rome for the Gauls was doomed for good. The relief army disbanded the next day, and Vercingetorix surrendered himself to Rome, where he would be imprisoned, later to be publicly executed 6 years later in Rome.
Wow. So he was just sitting in his cell for
Yeah,
6 years.
he was a prisoner for 6 years. Caesar would now be officially known as the conqueror of Gaul. Part 5. Hail Caesar.
Ah.
While this was going down, Julius Caesar died in childbirth. Pompey was no longer politically linked to Caesar, so he was offered his great niece. Caesar offered his great niece to Pompey, and he said no. And pretty soon after, Crassus, his richest man in Rome, was killed in a failed invasion of Parthia in the Middle East. And Rome has now set into a state of full-blown corruption, where politicians were now killing each other left and right in a way that would make George R.R. Martin excited. And Pompey was given emergency consulship, which gave Caesar the ability to stand for consulship in absentia. So basically his other consul, he just made Caesar. This meant that Caesar was the other consul, but was not physically in Rome. And this was a problem for Caesar, because Pompey started getting whispered by every other member of the court and people who hated Caesar, and their friendship basically reached a breaking point. Between 52 and 49 BCE, they pretty much grew to hate each other and distrust each other. Caesar was off securing Gaul, and everyone tried to get him to come back to Rome to control things, and he just kept saying no, because he hates Rome. And eventually Pompey was won over by the conservatives, and he took a hard line against Caesar. Tensions grew hot, and Caesar had a huge army, which made Pompey afraid. He was now, famously known as conquering the Gauls, which no one could conquer until then, like previously. So he just went and just destroyed them. And they're like, well, that was scary. And now he has an army. So Pompey begins to raise his own army in fear of this. And the Senate was like, you can't do that. He's our Roman general. So they put a measure out saying both of you as consul have to disarm, because you can't be consul and have an army. The vote had 370 in favor to 22 against.
Well,
and it didn't pass.
Oh.
Why didn't it pass, you ask?
Okay.
For reasons unknown, the Senate meeting was dissolved by a consul named Gaius Marcellus. The meeting was dissolved before they could officially pass the vote.
Wow. Oh wow.
And we don't know why. We do not know why this happened. There's rumors and stories, but there's too much conflicting stories to give a definite reason. Caesar would then propose the same bill himself. Caesar proposed the bill. From in absentia, he sent it in saying, Pompey, disarm yourself, and then I will disarm myself, and we can come back and be buddies. He did this in 49 BCE, and the hardliners against him did not want Pompey to disarm because they were afraid of Caesar, so the bill was stopped. On January 7th of 49 BCE, his supporters were forcibly removed from Roman office, and Caesar was labeled an enemy of Rome.
Ruh-roh, people are getting stabbed left and right.
Caesar responded to this by saying, okay, guess you're next, and marched his army upon Rome. But there's an interesting thing about this. Why did he march against Rome? It's not fully clear. It's likely because he hated Rome. But when you think about it, Rome was a broken system, and it was being perpetuated, which is why he hated it. But the reason as to why he would attack them is interesting, because he was exiled and declared an enemy with no reason. There was no evidence against him being an enemy. In fact, he tried to get Pompey to stop fighting it. And in the legal court system, he would not actually be able to be persecuted as an enemy of Rome and exiled, and charges would have to be dropped. And Caesar was a very accomplished lawyer, and he knew this, and he still marched his legions upon Rome. So, he just hated Rome. On the 11th of January.
We gotta get a counter how many times you said
I wrote that as its own sentence in my script constantly. It's just its own sentence. He hates Rome. On the 11th of January of 49 BCE, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon with his single legion, the Legio 13th Gemini, and ignites...
That's so
I know,
cool.
it's so cool. Fucking Final Fantasy ass. Anyway, he crosses the Rubicon and ignites civil war, famously saying to his general Mark Antony, "And so the die is cast."
Oh, yeah. Classic. They had dice back then? Wow.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry,
Oh,
I know
for
they
sure.
did.
Dice was like the number one gambling game. That was the Roman gambling game, was
I
dice.
think we talked about that. Also, we also forgot to mention at the time, beef patties are becoming a
Yeah,
thing
so
now.
this actually was it was Empire Rome. So in a couple years, like we're gonna start getting the beef patty popularity. I mean, but it probably means it existed now too. Food things aren't just invented like that. So I'm sure he just had it. They already had it.
Sure.
So as he did this, he would end up capturing all the roads to Rome, fighting little skirmishes along the way, but he controlled the communication. And he sent a letter to Pompey saying, "Stop this shit, come and talk to me."
Knock it off.
And Pompey refused.
Stop doing that.
So he still saw Pompey as a friend. I want this to be known. He thought Pompey was his buddy, because he never actually physically had seen Pompey since he was friends. He didn't know Pompey had been like politically partied, switched against him by being surrounded by a bunch of corrupt people. So he was just like, "Pompey, come talk to me." And Pompey's like, "No, you're evil." And so he's like, "Okay, fine." So he goes to Pompey's house to capture him. But before Pompey could get captured, Pompey actually escapes and heads to Hispania, leaving Caesar in control of Rome. So Caesar took Rome. He just walked in, basically. Mark Antony was left in charge, as he had to march for 27 days, Caesar did, to reach Hispania to fight Pompey. And he would fight his forces, back and forth in Spain on the way there, fighting a few battles. He actually almost lost a couple, but he never did. But eventually he would have a decisive defeat Pompey would have a decisive defeat against Caesar, fighting him in Greece on the 9th of August in 48 BCE. Pompey would escape, but he would wipe out his army. Pompey basically had no military at this point, and Pompey ran away to Egypt. Yeah. Caesar returned to Rome, hailed as a hero and a savior, destroyer of this corrupt politician. Remember, he was a populist. The people loved Caesar. Caesar was given the role of dictator by the Senate, which gives him. So this is a political role at this time. This is where the word comes from, but this is where the word starts. It is a political office in Rome as dictator. So basically what that means is the Senate gave him power. It's Palpatine, same idea. He was given full authority over Rome temporarily to basically figure shit out because they trusted him. But Caesar hated Rome. So Oh no. So he made Mark Antony master of the horse, meaning he was second in command, and he made himself consul, sole consul. So he was the only consul. He said, "I'll be the only one." And he left to go fight Pompey in Egypt. And as he arrived, a group of assassins approached Caesar with the head of Pompey.
Oh, whoa.
Caesar is said to have cried and killed the assassins, or put them to death. Because, again, he thought Pompey liked him. He thought he wanted him as a friend still.
Yeah, that must have been heartbreaking, actually. Because he was probably trying to still talk to the guy.
Yeah, he was. And so these assassins are like, "Hey, we got your guy." And he's like, "Fuck you, you just killed my friend." And he killed him. And at this time,
it's like really sad.
There was another issue happening in Egypt. We talked about Alexander's companion Ptolemy before, and how Ptolemy had started his own dynasty after Alexander died in Egypt.
Right.
There was currently a civil war happening between Ptolemy and a figure we all know, Cleopatra.
Coming at you.
This is the Cleopatra, by the way. Cleopatra was leading a civil war for the Egypt against the Ptolemaic dynasty, established by Alexander's companion, and Pompey sided with Ptolemy Egypt in the war against Cleopatra, so Caesar sided with Cleopatra. He would fight this war, and with his superior troops against, like, Egypt was paper compared to Roman legions, he completely destroyed Ptolemaic Egypt.
What you mean, papyrus?
Well, to be clear, Ptolemaic Egypt was actually Macedonians masquerading as Egyptians, but Macedon was nothing at this point. And he would basically take them out, and he would win the favor of Cleopatra. She would rule Egypt and be very close friends with Caesar.
Browse in the chat, everybody.
Very close friends. Browse in the chat. Very close friends. Cleopatra had a son named Caesarin, who was olive-skinned, weirdly enough. Anyway, so Caesar was never found guilty of adultery, but he was still married, but he didn't marry Cleopatra. But it was talked about, but he never ended up marrying her. Also, just to mention, Cleopatra kept visiting him in Rome, so weird. Yeah. Anyway, after all this, Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years by the Senate and would be bestowed the honor upon honor by the Senate. They kept giving him all these titles and laurels and everything. He had triumphs in the street for his conquests in Gaul. People did...
Gaul looks so good right now.
Conquering Gaul looks so good right now. People did like him. I would go ahead and say probably like 99% of people, because, again, they don't know everything, of course. This is ancient Rome.
Oh, of course. He
was seen as this, not only conqueror of foreign lands, in an area, in a time when nationalism was the way to be. He helped a lot of poor people when he was consul back in the day. He helped the poor be less, like, hated. He
gave them land.
He gave them land. He gave them jobs and stuff. So he was, it was a huge deal. People just liked him. But again, they don't know all these politics. They're just, people. But things started to change a little bit in that viewpoint at this time, because he was ruling Rome basically with an iron fist. And he actually, when he returned to Rome, started writing out his will, where he made his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, his heir. And if Octavius were to die before Caesar, a man who is his trusted general and best friend, Brutus, would be his heir. Mm-hmm. Caesar needed to make sure Rome was united and Pompey's faction was gone, so to do so, he increased his own power substantially, almost removing the Senate's ability to say no to him. And he reformed much of their laws, including the calendar, which is the 12-month calendar base we use today.
Neat.
When Caesar finished fighting in Hispania to take out Pompey's last remnants, he returned and had his whole triumphs about Gaul, Egypt, Pompey's forces. Massive games were held where men hunted lions, naval battles at the flooded basin of Mars. Circus Maximus hosted a battle of the death between 2,000 war captives.
What the fuck? Jesus
And the
Christ.
citizens started to complain about Caesar's extravagance. Worried at the cost of all these events, people were thinking, what is Caesar doing? How is he spending all this money? What is Caesar doing with all this stuff?
All right.
Caesar began to change everything as dictator, and he passed many laws to further the glory of Rome in his view. He outlawed guilds, because guilds supported political parties, especially anti-Caesar political parties. He passed a term limit to prevent governors from ruling more than 4 years. He had removed debt laws, forgiving the debts of all the poor.
Wow.
So
holy shit.
Now poor people were like, okay, maybe this guy is actually kind of cool, and started liking him a bit more after this. But the rich people were like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? Like, now we have to just not get our money back. So he just, exactly. Yep, you have money. You're already rich. You don't need more. That's what Caesar said.
Yeah, that's because that's kind of, never mind.
He used his powers to appoint senators he trusted, who were essentially subservient to him. and he filled him with his own part. He filled the Senate with his own partisans, giving him control over lawmaking. So while he fought against a corrupt system, he built his own corrupt system.
Yeah, which isn't good.
Yeah. So I just want to make that clear. That happened. Coins are being printed with his face on them. The septum with the face of Julius Caesar. He was the only one allowed to speak first in Senate meetings. Caesar started to merge all Roman provinces together into one nation. In October of in October of the year 45 BCE, Caesar resigned his role of dictator and became sole consul. Basically, he's the president without a second president, and he facilitated an election for two people to replace him. So he picked two candidates who he thought would be good follow-ups for him. He was going to retire, and the election happens, and guess what happens? They vote him in as dictator in perpetuity, which means he is dictator for the rest of his life. And if needed be,
He's the emperor.
He could take control of the consuls if they started acting out of line.
Right.
Now, Caesar hates Rome. So what Caesar did is he constantly left Rome to go visit Cleopatra, and he gave great power to his own lieutenants such as Cassius or Brutus or Mark Antony to rule in his stead. He basically wasn't there, but he was blocking laws from being passed that would help a lot of rich people left and right, like constantly be like, no, don't do this. And even some ones that would help poor people. He just started being really kind of weird at this point. Theorized potential dementia at this point.
Yeah, also, I was like, he probably doesn't give a shit. He's not even paying attention to what's going on his desk anymore. He's like, I just want to pump into my Egyptian lady.
He was born in the year 100. It's now 44 BCE. So he's 56 at this point. 56. So like he's getting pretty old. That's pretty old for Rome.
Yeah.
And on March 15th of 44 BCE, during the Ides of March, Caesar was called into Senate, given a petition to recall the brother of Titus Cimber, one of his generals, who had been exiled for supporting Pompey. Outside, Mark Antony was on his way in a rush, having caught word of something, but he was stopped by his friend Cassius, who chatted with him catching up outside. Inside, Julius waved away the notion of forgiving one of Pompey's generals, and his arm was physically grabbed by Cimber when he exclaimed, "Why, this is violence!" Servilius Casca, a senator, drew a dagger, slicing Caesar's neck, only glancing it, where Caesar exclaimed, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Casca cried out for help when a group of men started striking out at Caesar, stabbing him as he lay defenseless on the floor a total of 23 times. His last recorded words were "Kai se teknon," which translates to "You too, child." This is likely a reference to Brutus, his second heir and trusted close friend, who did take part in the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar, also likely where the phrase "et tu, Brute" comes from in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar play. But historically speaking, there is conflicting reports saying he did say that, saying he said, "Were you too, my child?" and even one saying he just didn't speak and pulled his toga over his eyes as he died. The assassination of Julius Caesar was done out of fear for his increasing political power and his seemingly decreasing state of mind, and it's unknown how people felt about it back then. What is known is after the assassination, Brutus and friends took to street, cheering and saying, "My people, Rome is free, Rome is ours again, Caesar is dead." But people did not come out to rejoice. Instead, they locked their doors. So it's kind of like they liked Caesar still, maybe. They kind of didn't hate him, didn't think he needed to be killed yet, didn't think it was that bad, or they were just afraid that Caesar was so powerful that if they were seen supporting his killers, that they would be taken out, kind of thing.
Oh, well, probably that, honestly. That somebody that, influential and powerful definitely has people watching still. So.
Yeah. Caesar would be cremated following his death, Mark Antony and Octavius would join forces and fight together in a series of civil wars against Brutus and Cassius, forcing the two out of Rome into Greece, where they would build a large army but end up being defeated by the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian. Afterwards, Mark Antony would betray Octavian and form an alliance with his new lady friend, Cleopatra of Egypt. The famous romance of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, that's a whole episode we could do itself. They end up committing suicide after Octavius shows up and says, "Fuck you, I'm stronger." Because Octavian inherited everything Caesar had. So he was very powerful. And one of the reasons why Mark Antony went against him is because he felt betrayed that he wasn't Caesar's heir. That Octavian was, who was an adopted kid who didn't fight with Caesar. So this resulted in the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who they both famously committed suicide when Mark Antony thought Cleopatra was dead and stabbed himself in the heart, but she wasn't dead. Cleopatra sees him dying on the floor and has herself bitten by an asp and dies of poison. That whole story happens.
Sounds interesting.
Not historically accurate, but it did happen. After this, Octavian would finish Caesar's role of uniting all of Rome together, taking upon the name himself Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. And that is where the story of Julius Caesar ends and the story of the Roman Empire begins.
Damn. Well, if there's one thing that I learned tonight, it's Caesar hates Rome.
Caesar hated Rome.
He hated Rome.
I think he's not as impressive of a conqueror as Alexander the Great, but he is a more impressive political lasting figure than Alexander the Great ever was. He built the road. He paved the road for the Roman Empire. He never was emperor. Right. His adopted son, Augustus, was. I think Augustus actually called himself the second emperor of Rome because he wanted to pay tribute to Julius as being the first emperor of Rome and the first Caesar. But yeah, like the title of emperor was called Caesar. That's how big of a deal he was.
It literally, like, a lot of what Caesar sounds like from putting it all together in such like a little micro dose of Julius Caesar history, like, it feels like, you know, after he had everything taken away from him as a kid, well, he technically was an adult, but, you know, as a kid, 15, 16, that's still a kid. Like, I can imagine that fostered a lot of hatred, not only towards Rome, but just towards, like, wealth in general.
Yeah.
Like,
with the fact that he had everything and lost everything, I think gave him a perspective that other people didn't have.
Right.
And that led his charge.
Who's worthy of the money and stuff like that.
But he is a story of someone who started off rich, lost everything, and then he became a self-made person, and ended up becoming a leader and a dictator. Like, he ended up becoming a dictator, and he was controlling stuff. Even when he was dictator, he kind of was doing some good things, but yeah, he kind of started losing it a little bit at the end and ended up dying for it. But historically looking at it, the assassination was a bad play.
Oh yeah,
it was a bad move. It was not supposed to happen. You know.
Yeah, like, it honestly sounds like. I mean, hearing it from this perspective too, in this way, it almost sounds like it was just like a couple of people really who were going to go through it.
So Shakespeare's story, Julius Caesar, of course, isn't historically accurate, but it is. Right. What is historically accurate about it is the major events and the fact that even the beginning of the play, Brutus is approached by I think it is the Cimber who starts it all, and he's like, "Hey, you want to kill Caesar?" And Brutus is like, "Are you fucking crazy? No." Yeah. And then it's just like Pompey, where he's not around Caesar enough, and he keeps getting his ears whispered, and everything he keeps getting a little crazier. And then they start, they kill him, and then they pay for it by getting murdered and failing to reform Rome, and Rome gets reformed in a much more extreme imperialistic authoritarian way because of it. So
it's a classic lesson that I don't want to sound like a cheese ball, but violence isn't the answer.
Violence isn't the answer.
But you know what is an answer, which we learned tonight? Get a bottle of wine and go sit in a fucking room together.
Go hang out with some alcohol and be friends, guys. And I think that's a great line to end the episode on.
Sure.
So everyone, thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll be back soon. Have a good night.
Good night. Bye.